The next time you climb into your MiG-15, just know that you may be a pawn in some puppet master's carefully orchestrated trap. Ahoy, capitalist rotors, anti-party right deviationists, and pro-Moscow revisionist opportunists. This is Type 56, the story of China's army. And boy, do we have a problem in the Navy. It's 1962, and the PLA Navy has suffered another disaster. So huge and dramatic that if you were a screenwriter, you almost couldn't think of a better one to confirm Beijing's worst nightmares about the state of the PLA. It all started to unravel on March 3rd, 1962. In strategically crucial Eastern Sea Fleet's 16th Fighter Regiment, one of the units that's in charge of trying to slowly gain air superiority over the KMT Air Force, one of their second lieutenants, Liu Changsi, went missing. He was only about 6 months out of flight school, not experienced to begin with. And then on top of that, he hadn't had any stick time in a few weeks. And now that he was back in the air, he was missing. 1 minute, the tower was tracking his MiG-15 over the East China Sea on a pretty unexciting training flight. And then they get a call from Lieutenant Liu on the radio saying, Mayday, 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 as his MiG goes from level flight at 16,000 feet to falling like a stone. And Lieutenant Liu called, I have smoke filling my cockpit. I am preparing to eject. Woo. So the whole 6th Naval Air Division dropped everything and went into search and rescue mode. Aside from human concern for their comrade, he's a freshly trained fighter pilot, which is to say a very expensive asset. These guys do not grow on trees. And especially now that the PLA wasn't friends with the Soviet Union anymore in 1962, and they're actually enemies, not only did the PLA have fewer people around to help train new fighter pilots, but they also needed more fighter pilots than ever to cover that huge, naked northern border that they shared with the USSR, that now was really a potential front for warfare. This is getting a little bit ahead of in our story, but we're going to see that border turns out to be this nightmare for both sides, a kind of ever vulnerable suppurating wound that would be almost impossible to properly police, much less defend with the resources that either of them have available. That's getting ahead of things, though. Now in 1962, though, um, the sixth fighter division is now on search and rescue mode, and as we know from our last episode about the submarine disaster in 1959, the PLA Navy was not exactly the first name in maritime search and rescue. And indeed, they came up with zero on the missing second Lieutenant Liu. No wreck, that was no surprise, but also no pilot to rescue, no life raft, and not even a body to recover. So, as night falls, back on the ground at the 16th Regiment, things were very, very somber. The regimental political commissar, because he was the head of the functions that nowadays we would term HR, he was responsible for things like graves registration, making notification to the family and the fiance, explaining to them why they don't even have a body to return to the village for a proper burial. He's probably going to have to go to that village in Hunan for an empty casket funeral. And friends, traditional Chinese funerals are not quiet, restrained, stoic affairs. So this is going to be grueling, emotionally taxing for the commissar. And to boot, he didn't even like Lieutenant Liu. Lieutenant Liu was just a pain in the butt, a cocky, obnoxious, jagoff, probably a completely typical fighter pilot. And so now that he's dead on top of it, Lieutenant Liu is more of an irritant than ever for this colonel, who is about to have the worst week of his life since Korea. Then the colonel gets a phone call. Lieutenant Leo is safe. Turns out that at 4 o'clock that afternoon, at a military airfield farther south, the base commander, who was an Air Force general, got a phone call that they'd picked up Lieutenant Leo's MiG-15 on radar and the tower had contact with him. Now, the tower already had several aircraft in a landing pattern. Because remember, this was an airfield that did not plan on Lieutenant Leo coming and making an emergency landing. And some of these aircraft that are waiting to land, they are already low on fuel, but the Air Force general says, divert them if you have to. I don't care if they crash. We need to get Lieutenant Leo back on the ground stat. And so the general gives the order. He turns out the whole base, even has his staff car brought around to take him personally out onto the tarmac to oversee this emergency landing. And then when the MiG finally rolls to a stop, the general actually rolls up in his staff car to the MiG as Lieutenant Leo is popping open the canopy. And out of the car steps the commanding general and this young chick in military uniform with a bouquet of flowers. And in minutes, Air Force radio has broadcast to a grateful nation that their heroic son, Second Lieutenant Liu Chengsi of the PLA Naval Air Force, had landed safely at Taoyuan Airport in the Republic of China on Taiwan. Oh, my goodness. Back in Zhejiang, the regimental political commissar gets this phone call and realizes it's not his week that's ruined, it's his career. No, 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 I take that back. His life is ruined. The whole regiment's career is whoosh. As the regimental commissar looks around regimental HQ, every officer that he is laying eyes on, everyone with so much as one measly pip on his shoulder board, is done. His career is over. Ditto for the divisional staff above them. They're all done. The regiment as a whole is disgraced, of course, and they are going to be transferred into China's version of Manitoba. But the officers in particular are completely done. They won't be transferred. They'll be cashiered completely out of the service. Goodbye, PLA. Hello to driving a truck, if they're lucky, on one of the dystopian rural communes that now dot the countryside since the Great Leap Forward. Their days of plentiful food as members of the coddled Naval Air Force elite are over. As the regimental commissar must know, that is how Beijing is going to interpret this whole affair, first and foremost, as a sign that KMT spies are still lurking under every cot and hammock in the Navy and Air Force. Because remember, from the beginning, the PLA Navy and Air Force have been manned overwhelmingly by defectors from the KMT Navy and Air Force, because they were the ones who had the training. They were the ones who had been operating boats and planes since long before the PLA had a Navy and an Air Force. Of course, though it's manned by KMT defectors, naturally, the PLA Air Force and Navy are commanded by old revolutionaries from way back, people who were maybe on the Long March with Chairman Mao himself. So commanded by old revolutionaries, but still manned by a lot of KMT turncoats. It couldn't be any other way. And in fact, as it happened, right through the 1950s, they were still getting a trickle of KMT pilots flying from Taiwan to the mainland as defectors. But it was not supposed to be happening the other way around. So, anyway, right from 1950, when the PLA could finally start training its own homegrown naval and air cadets, slowly, with a ton of assistance from the Soviets, that was still a big worry that any of these KMT turncoats might still harbor pro-KMT sentiment, might in fact be informing to KMT military intelligence in Taiwan. And even once they were getting training for their homegrown cadets from the Soviets, there was still a parallel worry about that. The old revolutionaries overseeing the PLA as a whole didn't want the Navy and the Air Force being filled with a new generation of officers whose heads were filled with too many Russian things. Typical Soviet heresies like the importance of technology and armaments over ethos and esprit and ideology. You can see our old episodes about those. They were worried that these newfangled, educated young Chinese cadets would see their service in the PLA as a career opportunity, more like a capitalist in socialist clothing than a sort of communist warrior monk on a quasi-religious crusade, which was the way it was done back in the old days. So, at the 16th Fighter Regiment, the commissar has to know that whether the PLA inquisitors, who are sure to come to make their investigation, whether they eventually determine that Liu was motivated by KMT subversive revanchist loyalties or capitalist opportunism, so whether by ideology or by greed, either way, the commissar has to understand that this debacle has just given substance to every bad prejudice about the Navy and the Air Force that exists among all the old heads, the Lao Tao, on the Central Military Commission in Beijing. Basically, every bad stereotype about the Navy and the Air Force being elitists, careerists, or just soft people who put their faith more in technology and material than in fighting spirit. Any lingering doubts that after, oh gosh, a decade and a half, they might still harbor spies working to Taipei, any of those fears have now been given more than enough substance that they will probably never be fully erased from the minds of the people running the PLA. This is the worst internal intra-service PR that the Navy and the Air Force could get. Meanwhile, in Taipei, though, it is party time. The KMT gave Liu Chengsi a hero's welcome as an anti-communist resistance fighter. And they made a gigantic propaganda spectacle out of him. They gave him a parade through the streets of Taipei in an open-topped limousine. They presented him with a gold watch, a promotion to major in the KMT Air Force. So from second lieutenant up past first lieutenant, past captain to major. This guy has had his wings for 6 months and now he's a major. Above all, most amazingly, they presented him with 50 kilograms of gold bars. Friends, that's 110 pounds of gold bullion worth more than 4 million in today's money. If they could have, the KMT propaganda apparatus would have towed Major Liu Chengsi behind the Goodyear blimp around the South China coast like a huge middle finger to the PLA. Well, by the end of the month, in Beijing, which is not exactly a haven of political repose right now, Lin Biao, the new head of China's military, has sent a huge 41-person fact-finding team down to the area around Ningbo where the 6th Fighter Division is housed. And this fact-finding team is led by one of his personal followers, General Li Zuopeng. He was always very pudgy by Chinese standards, and he was always seen wearing sunglasses, even like when he was at a reception with Chairman Mao. So I checked this out. It wasn't vanity. General Li had been in a gas attack during a battle against the Japanese, and that had cost him the sight in his right eye. And so now, even though I think it would have been way cooler to just wear an eye patch, instead he wore dark glasses all the time. Well, General Li in Beijing was the head of the General Staff Department's training division, and he was a personal acolyte of Lin Biao's, and so he was the obvious man to send down to the East China Fleet to find out what was going on. And he was so disgusted by what he found there that he expanded his investigation to cover the whole Navy and then submitted a bombshell report that wasn't just a scalding reproach to the whole PLA Navy. It was basically a hostile takeover of the Navy by Li Zuopeng and his master, Lin Biao. The report ended up being a kind of surprise hit piece on the Navy. I mean, everybody knew that it wasn't going to say uh, cuddly affirmative things about this unforgivable political disaster that had just happened. But nobody expected that it was going to be an indictment of the PLA Navy as a whole. The report said that throughout the Navy, political commitment was as firm and unyielding as a wet Kit Kat bar, and that Lieutenant Liu Chengsi was just the tip of the huge, nauseating iceberg of rotten capitalist roading sentiment. Liu was indeed a cosseted snowflake and an entitled enfant terrible. He was the son of a village party secretary in Hunan, and he'd been selected as one of the tiny handful who could make the grade as a fighter pilot. And so when he graduated from pilot training and he showed up at his first duty station at Luqiao Airfield, he was definitely thinking that he was hot stuff. And he was thinking of himself as deserving, not serving. And in fact, before long, he had actually been pulled off flight status and put on disciplinary suspension because he had this childlike meltdown when he did not get a wristwatch. Now, this takes a little bit of explanation. Even back, even back in the 1980s, a wristwatch was like, that was a status symbol in China. And one of the little perks for these fighter pilots was that they were going to be given a wristwatch. Fighter pilots need to be places on time, and so they would be issued a watch. But it just so happened that when Liu got to his unit, they were fresh out of watches. And in fact, the story says that the watch that would have been issued to Liu went to his commanding officer because the CO had lost his watch and it needed replacing. And so Liu ended up as first on the wait list for the next batch of watches instead of getting the watch that he had been fondly expecting and had been like bragging to all his friends that he was about to get. So when Second Lieutenant Liu didn't get his watch right on time when he wanted it, it was this huge narcissistic wound, and he felt that he had been personally and unjustly screwed by his commanding officer. And worst of all, he would not shut up about it. Not only was he complaining all over base, but he had to make a point of it. So he went somewhere and he bought this alarm clock and he hung it on a string around his neck. And he was like, well, this is the only watch that I'm getting. So he's like parading around like communist Flavor Flav. And his commanders were like, you child, you snowflake, we are not rewarding this behavior. So they grounded Lieutenant Liu, as I would, because he's behaving like a baby. And they told him, you don't fly until you lose your attitude and write a self-criticism. Petulantly, Liu refused to do that. And he stayed in his barracks like a kind of jumped up wannabe Achilles in his tent for over a month till finally he wants to get back in the air. So he caves and he writes a long and groveling self-criticism and gets back on the flight roster. And it was soon after that that he defected. The investigators interviewed hundreds of people, and they learned that during those weeks when Lieutenant Liu was on non-judicial punishment in his barracks and off the flight roster, his idle hands became a playground for the devil himself, Chiang Kai-shek, the butcher of the people, 屠杀中国人民刽子手蒋介石. Liu learned something that I think, in hindsight, was kind of an open secret at the airfield. If you were good with tools and gadgets and electronics, and heck, this was the Naval Air Force. I'm sure everybody was good at tinkering, and that's why they were picked for this job. If you were good at like tweaking electronics, you could juke your radio to receive this station that broadcast out of Taiwan that called itself the Voice of Free China, 自由中国之音. And it was hosted by this really hot sounding young woman named Chen Manhua, who got the nickname 空军玫瑰, Air Force Rose, like Tokyo Rose. And she would tell PLA pilots how they could defect, routes of travel to fly, recognition signals so they knew that you were a friend and not foe, and also inducements to them to defect. She would talk about how great life in Taiwan was. I gotta say, life in Taiwan is pretty great. And how they would give you promotions and gold bullion. This was part of a huge program that the KMT had started about a year before, trying to court mainland defectors. On one hand, up to this point, the communists had played the ideology game much better than the KMT. Propaganda in the Communist Party in China was brilliant, just brilliant, absolutely first class. And for various reasons, Chiang Kai-shek's KMT was never equipped to play in that league, propaganda-wise. But in 1960, the KMT armed forces got a really good opportunity. Back on the mainland, the Great Leap Forward was in full catastrophe mode, and the PLA leadership was getting maybe not decapitated, but at least it was having its head slowly sawed off, like in some horrific Al-Qaeda video. In the sense that the PLA was having its modernizing, professionalizing officers like Peng Dehuai purged and replaced with political yes men like Lin Biao, who would do Chairman Mao's bidding. And just a few months after Peng Dehuai was ousted, a random PLA naval aviator tried to defect to Taiwan. Now, it turned out he crashed and died. But the KMT propaganda people knew a good idea when they saw one. And they knew exactly what was happening inside the PLA politically. And they knew how many disaffected PLA officers there were about to be service-wide. So KMT military intelligence decided to try to provoke more defections. So they figured out, okay, where did that first random would-be walk-in defector come from? Turns out he came from a naval fighter division at Luqiao Airfield in Zhejiang. Well, they knew that place. That was practically Chiang Kai-shek's hometown. So the ROC Air Force started dropping leaflets there and at other mainland airfields, telling pilots how they could defect and offering not just cash inducements, but gold bars. For an Antonov 2, you'd only get 25 kilograms of gold. Still, though, that's $2 million in today's money. For a MiG-15 or an Ilyushin 14, you'd get 50 keys. Now you're talking. But if you rolled up in a Yak-25 or a MiG-19, now you're talking 200 kilograms of gold. Now, the only thing was, you would have to divide it among the crew if it were a multi-man aircraft, unless you shot someone in your crew or you landed so hard on the tail that you accidentally killed your tail gunner, both of which did actually happen with an IL-28. Price tag, 200 keys of gold. That pilot got 100 kilograms for himself. The unwilling co-pilot, I think, who he shot, got 50 kilograms. And the dead tail gunner's share of 50 kilograms of gold got split between the pilot and the guy he shot, who really did not want to be there and also had actually tried to commit an act that I'm not allowed to describe on YouTube. However, that unwilling co-pilot, he ended up having a happy ending. While he was in the hospital recovering, he and his nurse fell in love. And she admitted to him that she had been deputed by military intelligence to spy on him, which may sound like a big reveal unless you think Chinese, in which case, duh, of course people are reporting on you. Of course your phone is tapped. Of course there are microphones in the room. Are you a moron? So I can't believe that this guy was like, "Wait, what? You're informing on me?" But they fell in love and they got married and they lived happily ever after. He stayed in Taiwan, serving in the ROC Air Force, and then after retirement, he and his wife, the nurse, moved to America, and then the Chinese government got in contact with them there and let him move back to China because they knew that he had been dragged along unwillingly on this ship of fools. Anyway, apart from getting gold bars, PLA defectors would also get a commission in the ROC Air Force, which, let's be honest, had much cooler uniforms. And they would get a promotion of 3 pay grades. So if you flew over as a second lieutenant like Liu Chengsi, boom, you'd be promoted to major just like that. Anyway, it turned out that more effective than these leaflets were the radio broadcasts coming from the Voice of Free China. That was what Liu Chengsi had been listening to in his barracks. And the investigation by Beijing now concluded that that's why he suddenly flipped and repented of his bourgeois capitalist roading selfism and confessed the error of his ways in a letter of self-criticism, a 检讨书. Friends, a quick aside. The Maoist self-criticism is a really interesting quasi-literary genre. And for a time in the Mao and Deng years, they were a way of life. Heck, I wrote some. There are self-criticisms that I wrote that are probably still in a file folder somewhere in Beijing. I'd like to think that at least for some time during my youth, I was perhaps the Ministry of Public Security's foremost writer of Chinese language self-criticisms by a foreign national. And I'd like to think that maybe they passed the Turing test for plausibly native self-criticisms. That there was some, like maybe deputy division chief in the Gong'an apparatus who like read this and thought, okay, it looks like it was written by a 13-year-old, especially the penmanship, but I gotta respect this young foreign kid's commitment to the game. I appreciate that he enjoys our language and our way of life and our culture enough to want to learn to write a passable Maoist self-criticism. Okay, anyway, my point is, you don't have to believe that you have committed faults to write a passable letter of self-criticism. That's not the point. It's not a true confession. It's a religious ritual. You write the self-criticism, you bend the knee, display 正确的认识, so-called correct understanding of the matter. And then, in those cases, you got put back on flight status. It's a non-judicial punishment. Now, I would guess that because Leo had been such a pill, I think he was lucky that fighter pilots were so scarce. Because otherwise, I just can't see the officers above him tolerating that kind of adolescent entitlement. If I were his boss and I had had any choice in the matter, I would have kicked him to the curb. Well, when the investigators discovered this whole sordid mess, that Liu had been an obvious problem child, with the psychological makeup of a bratty teenager, that he'd been listening to secret capitalist reactionary broadcasts under his commander's noses, apparently along with half of the Naval Air Force, and then he'd played his commanders like that and handed the KMT this outrageous propaganda victory, which the KMT was now broadcasting and leafleting back into China to try to pick up even more defectors, successfully, by the way. When they discovered all of that mess in the Navy, heads rolled. They rolled in the 6th Division. They rolled all over Luqiao Field and all over the Eastern Sea Fleet. And in fact, heads rolled all over the PLA Navy. That was how the investigators ended up expanding their inquisition from Luqiao Airfield and the Eastern Sea Fleet to encompass the entire Navy and indict everything. Sure, Li Zuopeng's report started with the usual ritual praise for all the wonderful achievements of the people's dedicated servants in building a strong navy, blah, blah, blah. But the remaining 90% of the report was just this acid bath. It found a culture of what nowadays we would call toxic leadership all over the Navy. It reported that all over the Navy, there were units trying to exalt themselves, their own little unit, instead of the PLA itself. There were petty despots who set bad personal examples and ruled by harshness instead of personal example. You remember, this was one of the things that the PLA had always been worried about when they developed a more technical, more modern kind of force. Are we going to lose the familial culture of the PLA and that leadership by kind of fraternal or paternal example instead of by what they would think of as a more Soviet style rule by the whip? They believed that there was a lot of empire building going on in the Navy, officers here and there building up their coterie of subordinates and their own bureaucratic fiefdoms rather than thinking about the mission of the service as a whole. The investigation found that there were some small island outposts of the Navy where whole platoons did not have a single party member. No wonder their political thinking was so backward. It also found bad education among the sailors, bad morale, with some sailors committing permanent self-devitalization and even fragging their officers. And also, just days after Lieutenant Liu's defection, at the very same airfield, the senior chemical defense officer murdered a civilian official. The reason for this, of course, all of it, was a lack of political education. They needed more Mao Zedong thought, obviously. So the inquisitor who came down from Beijing to the Navy, he just never left. Li Zuopeng became the new de facto head of the PLA Navy. Now, they did this in a very CCP kind of way, without giving him the title of top naval officer. Theoretically, he was still just a two-star and only became the number 2 guy in the Navy. And I think that he actually retained his original job in the General Staff Department as head of the training division. But Li still was explicitly given first and last say over the running of the Navy. That was black letter policy. That may sound weird, but that's part of the Chinese way of running things. The rank and the job can be 2 quite different things, and the actual authority can be still a 3rd thing. And that's how it was that the PLA's theoretically commanding admiral, the 4-star Xiao Jingguang, was just put in a back office without being demoted or fired, and his real job and power was taken over by Li Zuopeng and his crew. For the purposes of this course, what this personnel turnover represents is Lin Biao taking over the PLA Navy in the early 60s to turn the PLA Navy back into an ideology-first military, just like he was doing in the PLA Army and the PLA Air Force. As we'll see very soon, some of the things that we think about as like founding elements of Mao's cult of personality, like the Little Red Book itself, were actually Lin Biao's innovations that he put into place in the PLA that later spread by political osmosis into the rest of the country. Needless to say, it wasn't just top officers who got moved aside. In Liu's old unit, as I mentioned, all the officers got the sack. It was only the divisional commander of the 6th Division who got lucky. He was seconded onto other duties at that time. He was away on a training course, a long-term one. Probably he was in Nanjing at kind of their equivalent of the Naval War College. And so when this whole disaster unfolded, he wasn't running the division. So he only got demoted from senior colonel, that uniquely PLA North Korean Vietnamese rank, from senior colonel to colonel. Liu Chengsi's family, of course, got completely rogered. His dad used to be the village party secretary. Not anymore. And Leo's little brother lost his spot at the university. And overnight, his family went from being a prominent family in their village to being a complete disgrace. Reportedly, Liu's father, at the end of his life, said to his other son from his deathbed, "When we finally liberate Taiwan, don't bring Liu Chengsi to my grave. I never want to see him again, even when I'm a ghost." That's the ultimate disownment. Finally, what happened to Liu Chengsi in Taiwan? Friends, as you probably know, the life of a defector is a harsh one. I actually know somebody whose mom was the next door neighbor of Kim Philby, the infamous MI6 defector. And if you're a fan of spy stories like I am, you probably know that Philby's days in Moscow after his defection were not filled with happiness. Liu's life in Taipei had a better start, but not a better ending. Liu, of course, was never allowed to fly again. He remained in the ROC Air Force, working at the very radio station that had broadcast to him and brought him over on Renailu Sanduan. He started with all the money in the world, but he was not blessed with a good marriage. Liu had left behind one fiance on the mainland. When he got to Taiwan, reportedly, he was dating or trying to date Chen Menghua, Air Force Rose herself. And on some versions of the story that I think I credit, she was actually transferred to the United States just to keep him away from Liu because reportedly Taiwanese military intelligence wanted to plant its own Yanxian, its own informer, at his side as his wife. Liu ended up being married off to Cai Jianmei, the daughter of a high-ranking Taipei police official, Cai Baili, and she was definitely reporting on Liu's doings, just making sure that he wasn't a double agent, making sure that his commitment to the ROC cause would not waver. I mean, the worst thing that could have happened for them from a PR standpoint would have been if Liu had somehow defected back to the mainland. I mean, that would be awful for them propaganda wise. Not only did his wife grow tired of him and siphon off his money and treat him badly, but also, worst of all, from the point of view of Chinese accounts, she was barren. His wife was secretly sterile, and so they never had kids. Now, there are many accounts of this that say, well, she had been working for Taiwanese military intelligence and been used by them as a Matahari, shagging men for information and then getting abortions to cleanse her womb of their traitorous seed, and then rinse and repeat. Now, I had real questions about this assertion. I mean, sure, I would absolutely believe that she was keeping an eye on Liu for the authority. And in her case, that wouldn't even require some elaborate Stasi-like surveillance and reporting because, I mean, it's a Taiwanese family. You don't have privacy from your in-laws in an extended family like that. Everyone knows everybody's business. Your father-in-law doesn't have to be a police chief. He could run one of those incredibly awesome Taiwanese breakfast stalls where they sell luobogao, and he would know your every move just because he was your father-in-law. Taipei is an extremely small city for such a big city. And sure, we know that Taiwanese military intelligence was and still is great with honey traps. But I was really skeptical that the daughter of a high-ranking KMT security official who was actually the personal secretary to Chiang Kai-shek's son and crown prince, Jiang Jingguo, going back 30 years, I just didn't believe that this guy was hoeing out his teenage daughter to get swived rotten by secret agents and then get botched abortions after they discarded her like used sheets. But I've also seen reports, and I really would like viewers to help me get more info about this if you can. I've also seen reports she had actually worked inside the Taiwanese military intelligence administrative apparatus under their number two, Tang Qimin, and under him both administratively and also colloquially. On that version of the story, Tang retired her from his service, so to speak, in her mid 20s by marrying her off to Liu Chengsi, this very rich defector. And so, on this telling of the story, Tang the spy master just saw this as a convenient way to pay off this mistress that he had grown tired of by marrying her off when she was kind of superannuated by local cultural standards to a guy who had a lot of money and she could do some useful intelligence work. If anybody out there who has better smarts and sources about the ROC military than I do, because I know nothing about the Taiwanese side of things, if anybody can help me find more about this, please do. In particular, there's a narrative. It's called 叛逃飞行员刘承思的一生, but I've only been able to find little bits of it. Part of it seems like it's been purged from the internet, but if you have better Google foo than I do or better ROC military sources, oh man, could you help me find the rest of that story? I'm addicted to it now. It's like better than reality TV, and I absolutely want to read all the missing installments. If you can help me with that, would you let me know in the comments or email me at the university at Chico State, please? Anyway, to end the story, yeah, Cai Jianmei, the wife of our defector, Liu Chengsi, she was totally a spy. And it was a rotten marriage. She left him in 1985. They didn't get divorced because that was still kind of unthinkable then, but they separated, which is still a very big deal. And he died alone and unhappy years later. Let that be a lesson to you all the next time you climb into your MiG 15 and you think about duty and loyalty versus the appeals of a wristwatch and a hoard of gold bullion. And just know that you may be a pawn in some puppet master's carefully orchestrated trap. Until then, friends, this is Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. I would love it if you would share. You could even visit our Patreon page. Heck, if you want, you can sign up for the summer course for college credit, as announced yesterday. Nevertheless, the course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants.